Welcome, everyone. My name is Amira, and I am the programs coordinator for Pardes North America. Thank you for joining us for this class in honor of Tisha B'Av. Over the course of the year, our plan at Pardes North America is to curate more opportunities for learning like this one today. Today, we are honored to invite a Pardes alumna, Professor Ziva Hassenfeld, who will be teaching on text and context, making sense of Megillat Eicha. Professor Ziva R. Hassenfeld is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Assistant Professor in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. Ziva has taught Tanakh, or Bible, in a variety of settings, including Hillels, Jewish day schools, congregations, and Batei Midrash across the country. She earned her doctorate in Jewish Studies and Education from Stanford University. She is a Wexner Fellow and Davidson Scholar, and most importantly, a proud Pardes alumna. Without further ado, I welcome Professor Ziva Hassenfeld. Take it away.
Great. So special to be with you all today, to be together on Tisha B'Av virtually, and to be part of the Pardes community that I love so much. And much of what I want to talk about today picks up on some of the fascinating discussions that happened in the last session, and really poses the question, what are we doing? What are we doing when we read this text? And I want to, in getting at that question, I actually want to start with the line that personally, every single year that I read Eicha and study Eicha before Tisha B'Av, it just hits me in a way that is visceral. And this happens, so throughout, we have 5 prakim in Eicha, and each one can stand on its own, and each one offers both sort of theological positions, but also very graphic pictures of what is happening. What does this destruction look like? And in the second parak, in the second chapter, once again, the narrator, Yirmiyahu, the author, he breaks the fourth wall and he tells us, he says, this is so painful. And then he describes this. And I'm taking us inside. I didn't title my sources, but if you're able to open the source sheet, this is the first source on the sheet, and it's called The Painful Image of a Mother and Child in Megillat Eicha. And we're told, Kalu vadmaot einai, chomar meru ma'ai, nishbach la'aretz kavedi, al shever bat ami be'atef olel v'yonek b'chovot kiryah. The imotan yomeru ayed dagan vayayin ve'hit atfam kechalal bechovot ir hishtapech nafsham alchek imotam. He tells us first, right? I'm going to describe something, but it's so hard to describe, right? My eyes are worn out with my tears. My stomach is turning. My bile is poured out because of this. And he gives us an image that is, of course, in some ways hyperbolic, because he talks about the infant, the newborn, the nursing baby, who, as far as we know, actually doesn't have language to say this, right? But the narrator takes the poetic liberty to put words in the baby's cry. And what happens? This weak baby cries out to their mothers and says, where is grain and wine? Where is food? And then we have this image of the baby essentially passing away, essentially dying. And this idea, of course, this year I read this and it's more visceral than ever, right? But the idea of the vulnerable child crying out to their mother in a moment of terrible suffering and the mother not being able to respond is a horrible image. It hits on a very, very deep vulnerability and fear of what it is to be human for any of us who have been a parent or a child. But then we're told, where does the child pass? On their mother's body. On their mother's body, right? So it's not that the mother can't get to them physically. It's not that the mother's not there. It's that the child is calling out And we get this image, this horrible image of pain and suffering, that the mother is actually holding her baby and does not respond. The baby passes away. And so I'm bringing us inside in a really slow, deep, somewhat painful way into these psukim, because I think there's something there that I want to explore with you all. And it starts with this question. It starts with this literary question. How are we told about the child passing away, about the children passing away on their mother? What is this phrase? Hishtapech nafsham. Right? There's other ways to say that someone passes away. Why would you say, right, literally their souls or their nefesh is poured out? And I was intrigued by this phrase. And I want to offer you all something. I'm going to send you actually to Havritza pretty soon to see what you make of it. But I was intrigued by this phrase. Of course, lishpoch we have all over Tanakh, and nefesh we have all over Tanakh. But the two together is quite rare. 4 times in all of Tanakh, we see this phrase together. And not every time does it mean death. 4 times it shows up. Here in Eicha, in Tehillim, Membet, which I'll come back to at the end of the shir, and in Eov, which I'm going to leave be for today. And the 4th place that I'm going to go into a lot is Shmuel Aleph. That we see it with one other mother in Tanakh. We see it with Hannah. So 4 times this phrase shows up, and I'm intrigued, and I invite you all to be intrigued with me, that our mothers of Eicha are put into conversation with Hannah. What on earth could that conversation be? How are they put into conversation? I'm proposing they're put into conversation by this unique phrase. So let's look at it in Hannah, remind ourselves of this story, and then think together, why would these women, if you accept my invitation to put these 2 mothers in conversation with each other, the mothers of Eicha and Hannah, why? What does this conversation add to our understanding of Eicha? So first, let's go to Hannah. And here, if you're on the source sheet, it's called A Mother's Pain. This happens at the beginning of the book of Samuel, of Shmuel, and Hannah becomes, of course, the mother of Shmuel, but she is suffering from infertility. She has not had a child. And so, as her and her family have their annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she decides to stay and to pray. And here we see, again, our phrase. Listen for our phrase as I read. Hannah hi medaberet al liba rak sefatei naot vekola lo yishamea v'yashaveha Eli leshikora v'yomer alea Eli an matai tishtakarin chasiri et yanech melaich. Hannah's praying her heart, and she's not talking. Her lips are moving, and Eli is somewhat comical, but if you've ever been in Hannah's place, it doesn't feel so comical place, right? She says, he mistakes her for a drunk and says, why are you drinking? V'ta'an Hannah v'tomer, lo adoni. Yishakshat ruach anochi v'yayin v'sheichar lo shatiti eshpoch et nafshi lifnei Adonai. I am pouring my heart. Here is our second mother with this phrase. I said my heart, my nefesh, to God. So in Eicha, we have the children, the vulnerable children, whose nefesh are being poured out onto their mother's body, who cannot even respond to them. And in Shmuel, we have Hannah, who's pouring her own nefesh to God. I'm intrigued, and I invite you all to be intrigued with me. If you accept my invitation, my literary invitation to put these 2 stories in conversation, because I believe that the text has invited us to do so by sharing this quite unique phrase, why are they being put in conversation? And so I actually want to hear your thoughts on that before I offer my thoughts on that, and maybe your thoughts will change my thoughts. And so I admit I've not done Havruta with such a large group, but I am sure that we can do it. Tech has told me that is possible. So I think we're going to do larger groups than 2. But what I actually want to do is I actually want to send you out with these 2 sources, with the English and the Hebrew and the colors. And to answer, take my invitation, come along with me, play with me with the text. And let's say that we're invited to consider the relationship between these 2 texts. So if we are invited, then what might the relationship be? What does the use of this phrase tell us about the connection between these 2 stories? So that's the question I really want to invite you all to consider. I'm going to give 10 minutes. You'll be put in small groups. We'll come back. We'll share some of our thoughts. And then I'll share an idea I have about why these texts might be in conversation, what that tells us. And invite ourselves to make the literary connection. What is the connection? And a few ideas we had, well, clearly, Ziva, you're going towards Rosh Hashanah, right? Okay, yeah, I am. But why? And do you want to come with me? What is the connection? If we're invited to make the connection, what could possibly be the connection between Chana and the mothers of Eicha? And so if you have an idea, just either raise your hand or put that hand raising reaction up, or any reaction. I'll know that means that you want to share.
Ziva,
Yes.
if you don't mind, maybe I will read out people's names and
Perfect.
then they can go ahead. So Abraham Glazer, I believe you were the first one who had your hand raised. Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good. And also, please, chat is, everyone have their chat, and I'm reading chat, and I hope that you all will as well.
Unfortunately, Abraham, we don't hear you. You're unmuted, but we don't hear. We'll come back to you in a bit. David Ellis, please go ahead.
My sense is that in both cases, pouring out the soul, I don't necessarily see it for the mother and child in Eicha as death. I see it as extreme anguish in both cases.
So there's something about this phrase, right? And that cues us that something extreme anguish, some very strong human experience is happening, a painful human experience. Amir, can we get a couple more ideas?
Yes. Spencer Garfield, please unmute yourself.
First of all, I'm very impressed with this connection. Shkoyach. Yeah, I'm still kind of thinking through it as I'm saying this, so I'm sorry if it sounds strange. I'm also trying to decide which part of it I want to share, because there's like easily 5 or 6 things that are really deep. One is like, the primalness of both of them, and that it's like a very universal primal experience, both by like internally and externally. Like people can recognize it when they see it, and also people can feel it when they feel it. And it's like an experience of personal tefillah, what that feels like with one person, and communal tefillah when it becomes this bigger conscious thing with a lot of people, viewed possibly from further away in Eicha.
Yes. And on chat, we're getting ideas, right, that are both pointing to the similarities, but also the contrast, right? That there's a sense of desperation, but there's also, of course, a difference between the mothers of Eicha and Chana. And I'm gonna move us forward, but keep participating through chat. And we're gonna, at the end, we're gonna come back and talk again. But I wanna sort of postpone the answer to the question. Let's leave it just a question. We're invited to make this connection between the mothers of Eicha and Chana. And I want to push it one more. If we're invited to make that connection and you're willing to come with me, then of course it takes us to Rosh Hashanah, because we learn about Chana on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. There are 2 other mothers who really stand out to me in Yamim Noraim. One is Hagar, who I think fits here, but we don't have time for, and one is Sarah. And so come with me to Rosh Hashanah and come with me to Yom Kippur, and let's think about Sarah. Now, of course, Sarah's not actually, her story is not actually read, but the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the almost killing of her son, is read. And so here on the source sheet, I'm taking us with our question very live of why are we making the connection between Chana and the mothers of Eicha? Once we're in the high holidays, let's look at Sarah. So of course, we don't hear about Sarah, but our tradition tells us that Sarah is the true victim of the Akedah. And it does so because right after the Akedah, right after the binding of Isaac, when Yitzchak is not actually killed, we learn about Sarah's death. And we're told, Tamot Sarah bekiryat Arba, hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan be'yavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah livkota. And the tradition tells us, Rashi brings us, building on 3 different midrashim that Aviva Zornberg writes beautifully about. What caused Sarah's death? Well, of course, the Akedah. Speaking of grief, speaking of mothers, speaking of pain that none of us should ever know, Sarah actually could not handle the idea that her only son, who she too had waited a very long time for, was almost killed by her husband on command of God. 3 midrashic traditions tell this story. In 2, Sarah is actually tricked. She's not actually talking when she learns about the Akedah, when she learns what happens, the learning of which we are told causes her to leave this world, to die. She's not actually talking to her real son. She's talking, right? She's getting tricked. She's talking to Satan and she's being tricked. In one version, Satan says, actually, Yitzhak died. In another, Satan dresses up as Yitzhak and is visibly traumatized. But in the oldest version of the Midrash, which I want to take our attention to in service of our question of what Chana and the mothers of Eicha have to do with each other, we get this very, very, almost profoundly real conversation between, there's no trickery, but there's a conversation between Sarah and her son, Yitzchak. And the question, of course, that we are going to read with is, okay, a near-death experience of a child is very upsetting and very traumatic. But then you see your child there, alive, well in front of you. Isn't that a moment to celebrate? Isn't that a moment to hug your child, to bring them close? What is it about learning that her son did not die that would cause Sarah's death? And I want to look at this question together in service of our mothers of Eicha. So here I am on the second page of our source sheet, A Mother's Pain, Sarah and Breshit. This is the oldest version of the Midrash that connects Sarah's death to the Akedah. Vayikra Rabba, Teda Sheken, Shechazar Yitzhak Etzel Imo, V'amra lo, An hayita pri. Yitzhak returned to his mother and she said to him, "Where you been, my son?" Marla, Nitalani avi v'he'alani harim v'horidani gefaot v'he'alani l'rosh harachad, uvanu mizbeach v'seder ma'aracha v'ha'arich et ha'itzim v'karoti al gabei ha'mizbeach v'kach et ha'sakin l'shachateni. Right? Yitzhak goes into great details to tell his mother exactly where he's been, right? Up to the point, right? My father set up, your husband set up the mizbeach to sacrifice me, right? And he pulls out the knife to slaughter me. Ilule sha'amar lo hamalach al tishlach yadecha el hana'ar kavar hayiti nishchat. And had it not been, and I'm purposely not translating ilule, had it not been that the malach said to him, "Do not send your hand out onto this boy, onto this na'ar," I actually already would have been killed. Wow. Sara looks at her son. She says to him, boy, I'll breathe right, derivata. Ilulei hamalak v'hayita shachut. Oh, my poor son. And she repeats back to him his words. Ilulei hamalak v'hayita shachut. Had it not been for the angel, I would have already been slaughtered. Marla, he says back to her, yes, that's what happened. Be'oto sha'a beta. Now it is tempting in hearing, reading this midrash and reliving the truthful, terrifying details of the Akedah alongside Sarah, as she does in this midrash, to think that perhaps she dies of shock or betrayal, right? How can my husband do this to me? How could God do this to me? But in reading this midrash on Tisha B'Av, following Aviva Zornberg, I actually want to suggest, looking at the words of this text, that the words of the midrash itself cannot hold that reading, right? Because after Sarah hears everything that her son says, and she repeats something back to him, the thing that bothers her in the text is not, right? She doesn't say, your father did what? God did what? That's not what's upsetting her. And here I come to the key line that I think is going to bring us back to Eicha. Actually, what she says back is, Ilulei hamalach kavar hayita shachut. If it were not for divine intervention, Yitzhak would have already been dead. I'm going to suggest that what causes Sarah's death, according to this midrash, focusing on her words back to Yitzchak, is not betrayal or trauma, but rather what she focuses on, what she repeats back, when he confirms causes her to die herself, is the fragility of Yitzchak's life and the fragility of life. What causes Sarah to die is elule, this confrontation with the fragility of life. Now, what do I mean by the fragility of life? Here, I want to take you back to our Eicha text and to Chana, and to say, okay, yeah, there's a literary invitation to put today in conversation with what we're getting ready for Elul, for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur. But what is that connection? And here, I'm going to build on a lot of ideas that came through the chat and in my conversations with some of you before we came back. Chana's pain, her desire for a child, and this hits on a theme from the last conversation, is a productive suffering, right? Her pouring out of her soul is a moment, yes, I want to affirm, I think that, and of course I'm just a reader, just like all of you, but I actually resonate with a lot of the ideas that came out, that her suffering, right? The phrase is keying us to her suffering. But I want to suggest that Chana is part of Rosh Hashanah, right? She represents a suffering towards, a suffering for, a suffering that is part, of course, of life, but a suffering that we know ultimately builds to a better life, to a better you, to a better us. And Chana becomes a paradigm of that. Chana perhaps is the paradigm of that, right? To pour your soul out to God because you want a child so deeply, and then to get that child feels like a happy ending. Not a story without suffering, but a suffering towards, a suffering for, a suffering in a world of order. On the other hand, that image in Eicha, that image that gets me to cry every single year, is not a suffering towards. It is the type of suffering that seems pointless, that seems beyond what the human is capable of holding, and is suffering of a world without order. Now, of course, when I say that, I understand that in some ways I'm subverting the theology of Eicha itself, and that you guys came here for text and context. And here I am, who am I to suggest a separate message, a subverted theology of Eicha? But I think it's there. I think it's there, not on its own as Eicha, but it's there in conversation with these other stories that it invites us to compare. A mother who is in a state where her child is fading on her body and calling out to her and cannot respond is not a purposeful suffering. It's a suffering of destruction and famine and war that we should all, please God, never experience. Okay, and I'm going to open it up in a moment, but here's where I want to go. And I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to hear what you missed, and I want to hear how I misread the Midrash or could have read it separately. The truth of the matter is, there are people who experience an Eicha world all around us. It's not just a place and a time, but it's unfortunately a reality of the world in the same way that a Chana reality is a reality of this world. And the two texts are in conversation. And where does Eicha and Chana and Sara and Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come in conversation with each other? I want to suggest exactly what you guys were suggesting to me, that of course Chana is the paradigm of suffering towards, whereas today and the mothers of Eicha are the paradigm of a suffering that is not purposeful, that is not productive. But we all know that at some point, someone lives in both worlds. That some people, and maybe someone sitting right next to you, is in an Eicha reality as we are in a Chana reality. When we live in community, we know that some of us are in an Eicha reality and some of us are in a Chana reality. And how are we supposed to do both? Which brings us to Sara. Sara's Elule is her saying, I cannot live with the vulnerability of knowing that there's an Eicha reality and there's a Chana reality, and that we could be in any of them at any point. And what's more, that we're supposed to be in both together as community. But what we do, as right here on the East Coast, we start to stand up on Tisha B'Av. What we do is we start to say, the work of Elul is to take today forward. To take today, not because we're going to have a celebration at the end, but because we know as we enter the year, some of us, if we want to live in community, we know that some of us will live in an Eicha world and some of us will live in a Chana reality. And that what we do as we stand up today going forward is we say we can hold it. As a community, we can hold it. We have the capacity to both have an Eicha world, an Eicha reality, and a Chana reality. And so that sort of begins to answer the question that I opened with. But of course, I want all the thoughts on every little piece of that argument. But the idea is this: it's not actually a coincidence that we are invited into conversation, that the mothers of Eicha cannot stand alone, nor can Chana, if you accept the idea that she is a paradigm of suffering for, and they are a paradigm of pointless suffering. We can't have one or the other because we have both. And so in this beautiful Lishpoch Nefesh, we bring the two realities together. And maybe what the Midrash on that Aviva Zornberg brings on Sara reminds us is like, it's not easy to bring those two together. And in fact, it's quite overwhelming. So I wanna open it up now. We can do it through chat. We can do it through Amira calling, but sort of, that was a lot. And where are you all? What do you think?
I'm going to start with the people that we missed from the first time around. So Bonnie Zabin.
Thanks, Amira. So much is running through my head, but just One thing I wanted to talk about before is we were talking about shvach nefesh, but the phrase that came to my mind was I expected shvach chametcha, like this idea of the anger. And when I reread Eicha the first time, they're still at nefesh, like they're not expressing anger, right? Which is both positive and negative, but I thought it just was worth bringing up that it's the soul that's crying out, not in the particular emotion, but in everything. The other thing, having here just to react more generally to what was going on, both Hannah and Sara are alone as this is happening. I mean, maybe in, talking to one other person, but they're not in that community. And when you talked about the community and not knowing where on the spectrum people are, I think for a lot of people, that community is part of the spectrum and the support and the nechama that comes from this, that, you can go to shul and pour out your nefesh, right? And be in a community of other people who are in the same dialogue. And that gives you comfort. Whereas in the Eicha world, there is no comfort. It's just never coming. Thanks.
I'm going to go back to Abraham Glazer. If your sound started working again, please let us know.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm Rena. I don't know. I don't understand the technology enough to understand why my raising hand changed my name to Abraham Glazer when my name is Rena Cohen. So you, first I loved the idea, the connecting all those mothers. But for me, it's not a paradigm. Each one of them is half of one circle. The fact that there is no love greater, more encompassing, more time consuming, more of all the superlatives. By the way, I don't like using superlatives. I don't believe in them, only when it comes to a mama's love. And for me, those two women just show me they complete the circle from before being to the end of a being. And anyone who knows who is a mama, and maybe more than that, and maybe others, knows if there is one thing you want as a mother is to close your eyes before your child. And that's what I think it is. And by the way, the mother in Eicha is for me the paradigm example from the mothers in Israel that are all put in that horrible risk. You send your child to the army, you have good chances to get him in a coffin. And I always respect them doing it because for me, I ran away from it. So I feel bad morally, but I feel good looking at my boys and not having to go through this hell of sending your child to war. Thank you, everybody.
Bracha Lieberman, I believe you were next.
So going back to the initial comparison, the tremendous isolation on the part of the mother and children in the first image in Eicha and in Hannah's situation, where how often do you have a woman that has to go out of her way to make a major statement? You would think that her husband would be helping her out with this. You don't hear anything about that. You just hear that she's taking this action. So it takes a lot of courage and a lot of breaking barriers, both on her part and also on the part of the children who are asking for specific things. They're not just asking randomly, they're asking for specific things. They really need special attention is what I'm getting from that. And the mother in that case is frozen and not able to give it. So it's both a contrast and a similarity there. That's very powerful. But in both cases, there is a situation of breaking boundaries when it's a desperate situation.
Thank you, Bracha. And thank you, Rena, earlier for sharing your perspective. Estelle Hafferling. Are you there, Estelle? Okay, we're going to move on to Aviel. Aviel K. Boston.
Yes, thank you for those powerful comparisons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So going back to that comparison between Hannah and the baby, people spoke about Hannah as the mother because she's a mother in that story. But for me, the way you pose the comparison, Hannah is really compared for me to the baby. The baby is crying out for his mother, and Hannah is crying out to God. And the mother is not responding to the baby. And God, God, she talks to God, but God doesn't always respond. And the whole story of Eicha is right at the waning of the time of Nevuah, when God still spoke to people back. But since then, God doesn't speak back to us. We have to speak to God, but God doesn't speak back to us. So, and Hannah, she doesn't even speak. She speaks without voice because she knows God, whether God can hear her, he will not, it's not like a real conversation. So the point of the comparison is that this baby really is suffering. So you were talking about suffering towards something, but really we know now the end of the story that she actually got her child. But at the time of the suffering, you don't know whether this is going to be a suffering for something positive or this is just suffering for the sake of suffering. And just one more point about these babies suffering for nothing. This is kind of the part of the whole problem of God punishing the babies and all the people for the sins of the whole nation. These babies, they did not sin, but God is telling us that they will suffer because of the sins of the people. And the same thing, we're coming up to the tochecha and the curses and the blessings. And again, God says, if you sin, there's going to be suffering, and there will be children that will suffer even though they are innocent. And if we progress it to our times, we know that obviously in the Holocaust, people were suffering, and it seemed like there was no purpose for it.
Thank you. I want to jump in for a second and then open it up some more, but it's very powerful. Thank you all for your thoughts, both in the chat and for talking to the group. Rena, I think that you picked up on right where this started, which is that if you want to face vulnerability and fragility in life, be a child or a parent, right? There's something about that experience that is just something else than anything else. To become a parent, to become a mother, it's a vulnerability and fragility that you've never experienced before in some ways, or never like that. The close reading point I don't want to lose, right? Because the whole thing stands on a little bit, it's a little playful, but at the same time, I am suggesting that the connection is meaningful, that I don't want to lose the fact that, of course, yes, Hannah is the one who pours her soul, and in Eicha, the mothers, and I don't want to lose it also because it almost adds to the desperation of the paradigm of Eicha. The mothers don't do anything. Their babies call out to them, and their babies pour out their souls on the mother's body, and we don't hear from the mother. And I don't want to lose that either grammatically, literally, or as far as what the image actually is, because if you want to talk about a suffering that is hard to understand, a mother who cannot even reach out to her own child on her body feels very, very difficult. Okay, I want to open it up to one more. I think I just want to add one last thing, which is that there are other parents in Tanakh, and some really important ones have come up, and I think there's more work to do around this idea, right? That I'm throwing Chana out as the paradigm of the successful suffering. Of course, someone pointed out, you never know if your suffering is for naught or for to become stronger until after. But I think if there were time, you could also push back, is Chana the paradigm of meaningful suffering? It's a great question, right? And what does it look like? Also, where is God in all of this? And someone brought up Aaron and his beautiful protest of silence after a lifetime of being Moshe's speaker, Moshe's mouth, right? And so parents as a theme in Tanakh, I think would make this even richer. But I do want to still focus on what we have here in this moment. Amira, let's get a few more because I know there are a lot. And then I'll say one last thing and then I will end.
Sure. Okay. In order, Marvin Foyer, Deborah Singer Frankis, and Nigel Blumenthal.
So in the effort to look at something that others are not looking at, which were very deep and meaningful, but I saw the word wine in each of the two early texts. And clearly for the babies, who it says explicitly are nursing, neither bread nor wine pertains to them. It does pertain to the people. And so the depth of suffering of the people is so enormous that you're hearing the expression from the baby, where is the bread and wine? It has no pertinence to the baby, but the baby's feeling that. And the depth of despair of Hannah in not being able to conceive is so desperate that she appears as if she's drinking wine, as if she's drunk. So we have wine in each instance, each of which is not really pertinent to the actor that we are examining.
Thank you, Marvin. I believe, Deborah, you're up next.
Thank you. It occurred to me about Sara that this randomness, this not being able to deal with the fact that Yitzchak's life was just hanging in the hands of this angel. It's exactly what she dished out to Hagar, what she couldn't deal with herself, that she throws out Hagar and Ishmael, and Ishmael's life also ends up being randomly saved in the hands of an angel. And it turns out that what we dish out to other people, we can't even cope with on our own. And I also think that it's very interesting that from Sarah's death, Abraham buys a place to bury her, and Sarah's death that results in the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and Hannah's prayer results in the way that we speak to God. And so I think there's something here saying that if you really want to figure out what's important in life, you better stop paying attention to empires and kings and all the things that men are doing, and look at what the women are doing with the children, because that's what's really important.
Thank you, Deborah. Nigel Blumenthal.
Hello, am I on?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Firstly, I want to thank you for giving us this Chavrusa facility. It's fabulous. I had no idea who I was going to be teamed with,
Wonderful. And yes, thank you for celebrating the value of Zoom, which is that it doesn't take much to get to be in Havruta with someone you've never met before, in a way that in physical space you actually have to move. Thank you also for the push on the wine. I really sort of wrote it off as hyperbole, the author sort of inserting in a hyperbolic way into the infant and nursing child's mouth, but you guys are pushing me to actually think more deeply about the wine connection. I want to end less on a textual point and more on a, okay, what are we all doing here point, which is that if it is true that there is an Eicha world and that there is a Chana world, and that sometimes our suffering is for something and sometimes our suffering is meaningless, or at least feels like too much, it's actually not going to make us stronger, it's going to break us. And if we know that those are two parts, two paradigms in the same world, then how do we avoid the fate of Sara? How do we avoid the fate of Sara? To be overwhelmed by that? How do we affirm that, yes, not only do we not know which one we will live in the next year, not only do we accept and see people who live in an Eicha reality, not in a send a check way, but see them. And how do we go forward in life as vulnerable people, as vulnerable mothers, not knowing which we'll be in and knowing for sure that someone in our community will be in each? I'm just going to propose one answer, taking into account everything that was said in the chat, and that, like, as some of us go back to communal prayer, in some ways it's not clear which is more powerful, but I would say one thing, that both Eicha and Yamim Noraim invite us to sing. And that sometimes when we're dealing with really, really difficult stuff, the blessing of being able to come together and to sing can be a way to move forward, to reaffirm. And so then I'll end the shir sort of with a blessing for all of us, a bracha for all of us in this year to come, after many, many months of not being able to sing together, that maybe this year in a safe way we'll be able to stand up on Tisha B'Av, move into Elul, and when we get there, and when we're standing with Sara and standing with all the other mothers and all the other parents and saying, we understand that there's an Eicha world, we understand there's a Chana world, and we want to be in both, and we affirm our desire to keep going, that we can do that through song together. Thank you.